On the surface, Diederik Stapel seemed to have everything an academic could want. His studies appeared in major journals, his interviews aired on Dutch television, and his classrooms were filled with students who admired him. For years, he was celebrated as one of Europe's brightest minds in social psychology. But there was only one problem. None of it was real. For more than a decade, Stapel fabricated entire studies, including data, participants, and even results. And when the truth finally surfaced, it triggered one of the most shocking collapses the field had ever seen. This is the story of psychology's biggest fraud. Stapel began his studies in drama and media in Pennsylvania, but eventually returned to the Netherlands. He earned an MA in Psychology and Communication Science from the University of Amsterdam in 1991, followed by an award-winning PhD cum laude in 1997. That degree led him to become a professor. For over 11 years at the University of Groningen and later Tilburg, Stapel was seen as a beloved teacher, someone his students openly admired. Even his colleagues loved him. Many believed he was one of the most trustworthy psychologists they knew. And if that wasn't enough, Stapel was also a prolific researcher, having published over 138 popular studies. But on what exactly? Well, his impressive career specialized in social psychology and studied how environmental surroundings influence human behavior and thoughts, otherwise known as priming. These studies would become famous in the media due to the conclusions he came to, such as standing in a messy train station or a littered environment can make people more prone to racism or prejudice. Seeing meat made people more aggressive and more supportive of dominance hierarchies. Seeing a clean environment or words associated with cleanliness made people more ethical and social. Stapel was known and respected worldwide by scientists for being vastly accomplished in his field. So, with such a perfect and all-around career, what could possibly lead to the downfall of someone who was not only a respected psychologist, but also popular as a media personality? With frequent appearances on television and popular media due to his charismatic personality, Diederik was labeled the pop star of psychology in the Netherlands. It seemed as though Professor Stapel had everything: a flawless career, strong accomplishments, a family of 4, and yes, that media fame everybody wanted. But beyond the surface of his highly illustrious career, he was hiding a dark secret no one could have ever expected. The seeds of fraud had been planted and growing since the beginning of his career. By the admission in his own book later, Stapel was frustrated with his work. He watched other psychologists publish groundbreaking findings, while his own experiments often produced results that felt dull or inconclusive. Even when the media loved his studies, the data never delivered the clarity or impact he craved. For example, he hypothesized that seeing attractive faces would lower people's self-ratings. But the real data showed no meaningful difference between participants. Errors are simply a part of scientific experiments, but for him, that simply wasn't enough. His perfectionist nature just couldn't handle failure. Stapel was seemingly at odds with the scientific method itself. He knew that when he did achieve good results, he would be awarded with praise and applause. This sensation was something he craved, but you can't just change studies when the data gives you imperfect results. Evidence is evidence, and scientists are trained to change their hypotheses and ideas based on what the evidence suggests. But for Stapel, terrible results continued to frustrate him more and more. He wanted and needed the praise, the applause, the success. And so that dark desire started to seep into his work in very small ways. He would find reasons to omit outlier cases that contradicted what he wanted and believed, or he would change the titles of the study to match the results. While these things are not in line with the best practices of science, and could well get him banned from publishing, nobody would classify them as fraud or something illegal. But when and how would this respected scientist transform relatively small, unethical actions into the unthinkable? Fraud. What would tempt a renowned researcher to change the very data itself and tell outright lies to propel himself onto even more success, simply to get all the praise and applause he wanted? Well, it all began on a normal day as Stapel entered his richly furnished office at the University of Groningen. He took extra care when closing the door, sat down, and tidied his desk more cautiously than usual. Thoughts were running through his head as his recent experiments had failed. He felt the pressure to produce a result, and fast. So Stapel committed to the unthinkable. He opened the file on his computer containing the data from his recent study titled Categories of the Self: How Social Comparisons Influence Self-Evaluations. The study was seeking to prove that exposure to highly attractive people would lead to someone judging themselves more negatively, but it failed to prove so. So Stapel clicked on the keyboard and decided to alter the ratings. He changed a 2 into a 4, then a little further, a 3 into a 5. It wasn't a big change, but it would lead to statistically significant results that would prove his hypothesis, allowing him to publish the study. There's a world of difference between sloppy science and criminal fraud. Changing the numbers crossed that line, and Stapel knew it. So for a moment, he clicked undo. But he'd worked so hard for this. His thorough analysis of the literature, 2 previous successful experiments, and hours spent creating this one study were all going to go to the trash, because of a few numbers of data that didn't match the hypothesis. No, Stapel couldn't accept it. So he nervously looked around and made a final decision that would alter his life forever. He clicked redo and saved the altered data. He had just falsely manipulated research data for the first time. A feeling of extreme relief washed over him, but a type of heavy guilt also settled into his heart. What he didn't know was that this would be the start of his transformation from a commendable professor into the biggest fraud in Dutch psychology. This would not be the last time Professor Stapel would tamper with his results. By his own words, "I became increasingly skilled in the use of techniques that could put a healthy-looking shine on otherwise mediocre results. After years of balancing on the outer limits, the gray became darker and darker until it was black, and I fell off the edge into the abyss." The scientific method is widely accepted as one of the most important methods for acquiring knowledge, so, as a consequence, you would think that science is tightly regulated to prevent fraud. But here's where deep flaws in the system are revealed. Stapel was a charismatic and friendly personality who had a ton of authority in both academia and the Dutch media, so nobody could have reasonably suspected foul play from such an accomplished and well-liked professor. Yes, not even his students, who worked closely with him, even remotely suspected it was possible. As a professor, Stapel was tasked with teaching students how to run experiments in accordance with the scientific method. Junior researchers would come into his lab to learn, but something unusual would happen. Instead of letting them do the research and allowing hands-on experience, Stapel would already have all the data from the experiments collected. All the students had to do to pass was to compile the data. From a student's perspective, this was very weird, as they never got hands-on experience with the experiment. But since they were just junior researchers, nobody ever dared to question Stapel's methods. They just needed to get good grades, and if somebody did ask more about the research, Stapel would simply dismiss it and tell the student that if he wanted to pass, he should just compile the data. And so for years, students received falsified data and never gained real research experience. Yet they still graduated from the university as if they were experts. They simply were none the wiser. This fraudulent data would now directly affect the future generation of psychiatrists. Despite data that seemed too good to be true and reasonably suspicious, hundreds of students stayed quiet since their own academic careers were under threat if they spoke out. And, of course, he was a renowned researcher. Who were they to question him? It was a problem of Stapel abusing his authority. But his career of lies would come rapidly crashing down when, one day, 3 smart students entered his lab. They became suspicious of the perfect data immediately, even joking among themselves that it was as if someone had made up the data. Even someone as prolific as Stapel would not get results this good, this often. These weren't the usual students just looking to pass his class. Over the course of several months, they would quietly play a double game. On the one hand, they kept working with Stapel as if everything was going well, but on the other, they conducted their own investigation into his data. Eventually, after remarkable patience, the big breakthrough came when they found identical rows of data in 2 completely different studies. Stapel had become sloppy and arrogant. This was a glaring red flag and a clear sign of falsification. The students had to act quickly, but there was still an issue. The head of the social psychology department at Tilburg was Marcel Zeelenberg, who was extremely close to Stapel. How could junior researchers convince Zeelenberg that Stapel, a renowned psychologist and dear friend, was really a fraud? They first tested the waters by describing a hypothetical case of fraud without mentioning any names, to which Zeelenberg replied forcefully, they should hang him from the highest tree. They knew he wouldn't tolerate fraud, so after a bit of waiting, it was finally time to reveal the secret. The students spoke to Zeelenberg at a conference in London, which was done so that he would remain calm and immediate confrontation could be prevented. After an intense back and forth, Zeelenberg was shocked, but also convinced that the students had a good point. When they got back to the Netherlands, they formally reported their concerns to the principal Philip Eleander, who immediately launched an investigation. If any of the accusations were true, this would be the biggest controversy in social psychology and a massive hit to the university and the field as a whole. Tensions were extremely high as Eleander confronted Stapel and began intense questioning. How was the data collected? Where did he get it from? Why was similar data found in different studies? Initially, Stapel defended himself, even offering to show places where he collected the data from. Eleander and his colleagues were extremely conflicted, so they gave him the benefit of the doubt and continued investigating. Stapel was under extreme psychological stress, realizing that his career was falling apart in front of his eyes, and there was no way of hiding the years of fraud anymore. This pressure took its toll. He had no idea how close investigators were to uncovering his manipulated data and fabricated studies. And underneath it all was the guilt of knowing he could no longer stop what had begun years earlier, when the first small lie, a 2, quietly turned into a 4. Eventually, he mentally collapsed, and around September 6th, Stapel gave a full confession and admitted to falsifying data. Stapel was suspended immediately from Tilburg University. The news left students, professors, and even the public stunned and growing in disgust. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg, as what follows next is the discovery of elaborate methods of fraud that span over 15 years of research and would cause tremendous damage to the field of social psychology. How deep had his fraud truly infected academia? And if everything that came to light was as extensive as they thought, what should Stapel's punishment be? In September 2011, 3 separate investigative committees were formed. Their mission? To examine all 137 of Stapel's papers, 18 doctoral theses, and all of his book chapters in order to determine the absolute extent of his fraud. This was one of the most serious investigations conducted in psychology, in which, for the first time, the whole body of a fraudster's work would be scrutinized thoroughly. 18 senior academics, including 5 statisticians, examined the papers, while 93 people who interacted with Stapel were interviewed. What the committee found was worse than any of the colleagues, students, and the Dutch media could have imagined. 55 of his publications contained definite fraudulent data, while 10 more had strong evidence for fraud. In total, 58 of his studies were retracted. To make things worse, Stapel's own PhD thesis, for which he gained an award, contained 2 chapters with evidence of fraud. It turns out, the dark temptation had been there for his whole career. Most notably, 10 of his students' PhD theses unknowingly used his fake studies as a reference. Overall, millions of people could have read his studies, or articles related to his studies, as his work was widely featured in major outlets like the New York Times and other major outlets in Dutch media. Considering the popular appeal of psychology and Stapel's great reputation, we can assume that the vast majority of the people who read this accepted his conclusions. Due to his actions, people believed false information, students' careers were hurt, and the trust in the entire field was severely undermined, which would inadvertently hurt colleagues and universities. Stapel had spent most of his life acting as a facade of an accomplished professor and psychologist. He may have left acting school at the start of his journey, but he never stopped acting, for he was never who he claimed to be. The only question that remains is, how did one man manage to commit such massive fraud right under the noses of students, colleagues, the media, and the entirety of the scientific field for over 15 years? At the start, he just altered existing data, but as the years passed, Stapel formulated complete studies including a theory, hypotheses, methods, and participants, then created completely fictitious data. His modus operandi was simple. After creating the highly attractive and headline-making study, he took all the materials home, fabricated all the data on his computer, and made it such that it perfectly supported the hypotheses of the study. After a while, he came back to the lab with the fabricated data, and then his students or collaborators analyzed and wrote up the results, which, of course, were always perfect. When he was asked where the data came from, he claimed to have special access to schools and other venues that knew him and didn't want outside researchers present. Most people just shrugged this off since nobody's first assumption would be that their own professor and colleague is lying to them. This went on for 15 years. But Stapel's own perfectionism was also his downfall. He was caught because his results seemed too perfect to be true. But why would he go through all the trouble and risk of ruining his career just to fabricate his studies? In Stapel's own words, he was obsessed with the goal of achieving career success, and as a result, he gradually trampled all ethical principles, committing the unthinkable. He saw the applause, the fame, and the recognition of his successful colleagues like Connerman and Cialdini. His perfectionist personality forced him to want fast success even at the cost of his ethics and morals. Stapel felt compelled to issue an apology. "I have failed as a scientist, as a researcher. I have manipulated research data and faked studies. Not once, but several times, not for a short period, but over a longer period of time." Regardless of what Stapel felt, the damage was already done. This fraud had caused irreparable damage to the field of social psychology, and he had to be punished for what he did. But how? Well, Tilburg University sought criminal prosecution. After all, Stapel had knowingly created 58 fraudulent studies, damaging the reputation of the institutions he worked for and the careers of his graduate students and collaborators. This went on for months. In June 2013, a plea bargain was reached, and it was unbelievable. For his fraud, Stapel was given a measly 120 hours of community service and had to forfeit 1.5 years of his salary. That was all. He was not found guilty of defrauding taxpayers since he had spent the grant money on legitimate activities like salaries for researchers. And in truth, Stapel had never cared much about the money. He wanted the fame and the recognition. But fortunately, despite the lenient sentence, Stapel would never return to practice scientific research again due to his ruined reputation. So instead, he reinvented himself as an author, writing a book about the entire scandal. In the end, Stapel claimed to regret what he had done. But the truth is, he concealed the fraud for over 15 years and only apologized after he was caught, almost certainly to save face. He received a remarkably light punishment and was still able to profit from his crimes against science by publishing a book. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman wrote an open letter to researchers in the field. "Your field is now the poster child for doubts about the integrity of psychological research. I see a train wreck looming." The story of fraud revealed systematic issues in the way studies of psychology are conducted. And it wasn't just Stapel. In a 2015 anonymous survey of 2,000 American psychologists, 70% admitted to cutting corners, while 1% admitted to falsifying data. Many studies were reevaluated and found to fail to pass the test of time. It was found that the field of psychology is rife with inaccurate and sometimes fraudulent research findings. And while all of this sounds negative, it's important to understand that the case of Diederik Stapel stands as a clear example that scientific fraud will always eventually be discovered. The vast majority of research is peer-reviewed and honest, pushing the knowledge of humanity ever forward. At the very least, this saga is what allowed experts in the field to enhance journal standards and create preventative measures against research manipulation. And in the end, Diederik Stapel will be remembered as one of the most infamous fraudsters in science. However, there are many more infamous academic controversies that you may not know about. If you enjoyed this video, we'd appreciate the support of a like and subscribe so we can create more high-quality documentaries for you. Thanks for watching!